didn't we act? How could we have ignored all of these warnings? So I would encourage our colleagues to continue to work with us and to come together and enact this vitally needed legislation. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, what is the parliamentary situation?
The Senate is currently on the nomination.
Mr. President, let me just speak briefly to that. It's interesting that we even have to be waiting on something that should have gone through months ago. Republican senators delayed a final vote on the nomination of Judge Alaberto Jordan of Florida, even though the Senate voted 89-5 last night to end a Republican filibuster. This prevented a vote for 4 months. You know, this is a consensus nominee. He has the strong support of the senior senator from Florida, Senator Bill Nelson. He's also strongly supported by the Republican senator from Florida, Senator Marco Rubio. It should have been confirmed months ago. In fact, you get a vote of 89-5 on cloture, he should have been able to go through then. Instead, obstruction needlessly delayed the Senate acting to fill the emergency judicial vacancy in the 11th Circuit. And a remarkable person to be there, this first Cuban American to go on the 11th Circuit. Senator Nelson worked hard for this nomination. He worked to get Judge Jordan's nomination cleared by every single Democratic senator in October, immediately after his report unanimously by the Judiciary Committee. Let me just explain what that means. We voted in the Judiciary Committee, the distinguished presiding officer was there. Every single Republican, every single Democrat voted to report him out of committee for confirmation. Senator Nelson immediately got every single Democratic senator, this is back in October, to say we have no objection to this nomination going forward and being passed today. But it was blocked in October. We were ready to vote then. It's blocked by the Republicans. So we're ready to vote in November on him. It's blocked by the Republicans. We're ready to vote before the end of the last session of Congress in December. Blocked by the Republicans. We were ready to vote in January when we came back. Blocked by the Republicans. Now it's hard to believe it's now the middle of February, months later, and the Senate still has not voted to fill this judicial emergency vacancy affecting the people of Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And I understand why Senator Nelson is frustrated. He expressed that yesterday on the floor. I understand why Hispanics for a Fair Judiciary and the Hispanic National Bar Association are frustrated too. They know that every single Democrat was ready to vote for this good man in October, November, December, January, now in February. They can't understand why the other side won't allow a vote. The needless delay, Judge Jordan's confirmation is an example of the harmful tactics of all but paralyze the Senate confirmation process. They're damaging our federal court. It shouldn't take 4 months and require a cloture motion to proceed to a nomination to fill a judicial emergency vacancy on the 11th Circuit. It's irresponsible. It should not take more months and more cloture motions before the Senate finally votes on the nearly 20 other superbly qualified judicial nominees who have been stalled by Senate Republicans for months, while vacancies continue to plague our federal courts and delay justice for the American people. Somebody's going to go to a federal court seeking justice, they don't ask whether they're Republicans or Democrats. They ask, is the court open? We have all these vacancies. The court's closed. We have judges that can be confirmed tomorrow, today, right now, and fill those vacancies. The American people need and deserve federal courts ready to serve them, not empty benches and long delays. I'd ask consent to my full statement be made part of my...
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, I also want to respond briefly to comments of the junior senator from Kentucky regarding his amendment to cut off all U.S. aid for Egypt. Let's take a little step back here. Let's understand what we're talking about. The new conditions on military aid for Egypt, which I wrote with Senator Lindsey Graham, passed by an overwhelming bipartisan majority in this body, and were signed into law just 2 months ago, requires certification by the Secretary of State that the Egyptian military is supporting the transition to civil government and protecting fundamental freedoms and due process. Of course, upholding their obligations under their treaties with Israel. If the crisis involving the non-governmental organizations whose offices were raided and now facing criminal charges is not resolved satisfactorily, well, there's no way the certification can be made, and Egypt will not receive $1.3 billion in U.S. military aid. But the Leahy-Graham conditions give the administration flexibility to respond to this crisis. If we take a leap into the lurch and adopt the Paul Amendment, we risk causing a backlash and the opposite reaction of what we want. Right now we have leverage. He's proposing to take away all leverage. And it really is ironic. The junior senator from Kentucky who is now insisting on a vote on his amendment to cut off all aid, not just military aid, but economic aid, didn't even vote when the omnibus bill that contained the Leahy-Graham certification requirement came up. In fact, I asked him when he was here on the floor if he was aware of it. Well, he had not voted. It was not apparently otherwise occupied and did not vote the day that came up. But his amendment is all or nothing. Unfortunately, the real world is not that black and white. No one disagrees with the goal of the amendment from the senator from Kentucky, Senator Paul. Because its purpose is no different than the Leahy-Graham provision, which we've all passed. That's caused the suspension of military aid. Right now, there's no military aid going to Egypt because of Leahy-Graham. All of us are outraged by the crackdown against the NGOs. I've spoken about it, not only on the floor, but elsewhere. We want the charges dropped. We want their property returned so they can resume the pro-democracy work. But the scope of the Paul Amendment is so sweeping that it could backfire and make the situation immeasurably worse. The amendment cuts off all U.S. aid to Egypt, current and prior year, including hundreds of millions of dollars in economic aid and funding for anti-terrorism and non-proliferation programs, anti-terrorism programs like those that are used to help cut off arms going to Gaza. Those are the arms shipments to Gaza. The aid that we give the government of Egypt to interdict arms shipments to Gaza would be cut off by the Paul Amendment. But there's a lot more at stake. The fate of the 19 American citizens facing criminal charges in Egypt and Egypt's continued adherence to the Israeli-Egyptian peace agreement could be jeopardized. It could jeopardize overflights for U.S. military aircraft or access to the Suez Canal. But also, leaves wide open the potential for further crackdowns against Egyptian civil society organization. Now, if the administration were ignoring the Leahy-Graham amendment and the certification requirement in current law, well, then I might vote for this amendment, but they're not. In fact, the same NGOs it claims to be defending have repeatedly praised the administration's efforts on their behalf. They've applauded the new leverage that they have that's provided by the Leahy-Graham conditions. Both the State Department and the Pentagon are intensely focused on trying to resolve this. As the news accounts noted, General Dempsey was just in Egypt meeting with top military officials about it, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Now, over the coming days or weeks, the situation continues to deteriorate. Our leverage does not accomplish something, well then revisit it. But I would urge the junior senator from Kentucky to withdraw his amendment till that time and to refrain from obstructing other business in the Senate. Let's see how things play out. And hopefully cooler heads will prevail. The Egyptian military recognized that these NGOs were doing nothing more than supporting the transition to democracy in both an appropriate and transparent manner. And that the Egyptian military agreed it's in Egypt's best interest to preserve close relations with the United States. And it's their best interest to maintain their adherence to the treaty between Israel and Egypt. Let's do that. In the meantime, we're holding back the money. And Egypt knows we have that leverage. Don't take that leverage away. This is not the time to do it. Right now, we need all the leverage we can have. Mr. President, I see other senators on the floor, and so I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Alabama.
Mr. President, we had this morning in the Budget Committee hearing the testimony of Mr. Zients, the OMB director who works for the President and prepares under the President's direction the budget that they submit to Congress for the United States for fiscal year 2013 beginning October 1st. It's an important document. It's an important time because in it the President lays out his plan for what this nation needs to do, not just this year, but for 10 years. 10 years that during a time in which our debt crisis remains the #1 threat to America, really. That's what the experts from the President's own debt commission told us. We've never faced a more predictable economic crisis if we don't change our course of borrowing. We are now spending $3,700 billion a year and taking in $2,200 billion, borrowing 40% of what we spend. So it was an important hearing. I was deeply disappointed that the new director, Mr. Zients, seemed to be focused on one thing, and that is regurgitating the talking points that he had been provided and steadfastly avoiding answering simple, important questions put to him by members of the committee. We have two members of the committee here that I think will be sharing remarks about what we talked about today and how we need to address our debt crisis. Senator John Thune and Senator Kelly Ayotte. They were there and participated and asked questions. I think we all agree that it was one of the worst witness performances in terms of being responsive to the questions that we've seen in our time in the Senate. I hate to say that. I know he was told not to say anything, just to keep repeating the talking points. But when America is facing a financial crisis and you're asking the budget director fundamental, simple questions, you expect and have a right to expect answers. Not for me, but for the American people. He does not work for the Obama political campaign. Mr. Zients works for the American people. He's a man that has access to the foot-thick 4-volume budget that was sent out, and he helped write it. Under his supervision, it was written. So we should be able to get straight answers immediately from this gentleman. For example, I asked a simple question right off the bat. Does the President's budget spend more money than the agreement we reached last August over raising the debt limit for America? Does it spend more or less? And it went on for 4 minutes, and I kept repeating again and again, well, is it more or less? Is it more or less? And finally, at some point, he said the President's budget would spend less. And that's not accurate. It spends at least $1.5 trillion more. So the budget director can't get straight whether or not the President's budget spends more, and is $1.5 trillion off? $1 trillion is a lot of money. So I felt strongly about it. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to enter into a colloquy with my Republican colleagues for up to 30 minutes.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I see Senator Thune is here, and he's been through a lot of these matters and a lot of hearings, and his time in the Senate, part of leadership here in the Senate, and I would ask him how he felt about the hearing this morning and the issues our country faces.
Well, Mr. President, I thank the distinguished ranking member on the Budget Committee for engaging this discussion, and anxious to hear from our colleague from New Hampshire, Senator Ayotte. But she was there this morning and was able to ask questions of the witness, the panelists that we had in front of the Budget Committee. And I guess what struck me about listening to that discussion was just the evasiveness that we got from Mr. Zients. And in fact, as the Senator from Alabama has mentioned, failure to respond to just very direct questions, and not questions that are trick questions, questions that are a matter of the facts. And I think what I was struck by, too, is when he was asked about whether or not the administration wanted Majority Leader Reid to bring the President's budget to the floor, he couldn't give a direct answer, and his comments indicated that they would not be calling on the Majority Leader to bring the President's budget before the Senate. And the other thing that, too, I was struck by is that the President's own budget chief could not confirm, verify, that the President had added already about $5 trillion to the debt since taking office. Those are both things that just seem like very straightforward questions and should have been very straightforward answers. But the fact of the matter is, it's very difficult, I think, for him or any other official in this administration to defend this budget. And this budget is not a serious budget. And even people on the other side, people in the media, have all passed judgment on this and basically said that this is not the kind of budget that takes on the challenges the country faces. And I would say to my colleagues that it's hard to take this seriously when they aren't serious about it, but they ought to be, because these are serious times. We live in a time where we're running already a $15 trillion debt. This budget would add $11 trillion to that debt over the next 10 years. We are living at a time when we've got European countries who are on the collapse or are on the verge of fiscal collapse with regard to their economic and fiscal situations, much of which we are watching on a daily basis unfold in front of us, and what that might mean for our country. And hopefully there is something instructive about that, because clearly to me, we need to be taking a page out of what's happening there and getting our house in order now. We have made promises to the American people that we can't keep. We need to reform our entitlement programs, and that probably more than anything else to me was the biggest disappointment in the President's budget, because it's the 4th year in a row now where he's proposed a budget which doesn't do anything to address the fundamental drivers of federal spending. And by that, I mean the mandatory part of the budget. That's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, all those different programs represent today, with interest on the debt, about 64% of all federal spending. At the end of the 10-year period, they would represent 78% of all federal spending. And so what this budget is a dramatic increase in the amount that we are spending on these various programs. That is what is driving federal spending today. That is what will drive federal spending into the future. And that's why a failure and a lack of leadership when it comes to the issue of entitlement reform is so disturbing. And it really is a missed opportunity. Now, I understand this is an election year. Everybody says this is a campaign document. This is a political document. That does not absolve the President or us of the responsibility that we have, the American people, to start making some decisions around here that will get this country back on the right fiscal track. And so when you propose a budget that spends literally $47 trillion over the next 10 years is basically what we're talking about here. Now, you haven't done much to bend the spending curve in the right direction. So I would strongly disagree with Mr. Zient's statement today that this is a, quote, very tight budget, I think is how he described it. We do have governors around the country who are making some tough decisions to balance their state's budget. The federal government ought to do the same. South Dakota is a good example of that. We made some very difficult decisions this last year, and as a consequence of that, our budget situation is much better this year, but it was because they had the courage to step forward and do some things that needed to be done. The budget's been proposed by the President, fails to rein in the government spending and to balance the budget. As I said, it adds to $11 trillion to the national debt, which would reach, if you can believe this, nearly $26 trillion by the end of the decade under the proposal that the President put forward. And so I can go on, but I would say to my colleague from Alabama and to my colleague from New Hampshire that based upon what we heard this morning, I have no more, I don't feel very reassured, I guess, that this administration gets it. And the President's budget submission clearly was an example that they don't get it, and the defense of it this morning that we heard in front of the Budget Committee certainly reinforced that impression with me. But I'd be interested in knowing what the senator from New Hampshire who was there and was able to ask questions of that panelist, of the OMB, acting OMB director, or what she thought based upon the testimony that we heard this morning.
I thank my colleague from South Dakota and also my colleague from Alabama, the ranking member of the Budget Committee. And I was deeply troubled this morning because I asked Mr. Zients about the President's budget and my concern that under the trajectory of the President's budget that we would be reaching $26 trillion of debt in the next 10 years under his budget. And I was shocked when he described the President's budget as a milestone, leadership. This, to me, is not leadership. And if it's a milestone for anything, this budget is a milestone for bankruptcy and what we see happening in Europe and other areas of the world that we don't want to happen to our country. And when, I think about it, I'm the mother of 2 children. How could we possibly ask our children to pay back $26 trillion in debt? It's outrageous, and I was really surprised that Mr. Zients couldn't answer basic questions like how much debt has been added under this President. As the senator from South Dakota mentioned, it's close to $5 trillion in debt. And also our entitlement programs. I mean, I know my grandparents are relying on Medicare, Social Security, and I asked Mr. Zients, the Medicare trustees have said that Medicare is going bankrupt in 2024. We know that Medicare is a huge driver of our unsustainable debt, and that if we don't act to preserve these programs, then the people who are relying on them are going to be put in a horrible position very soon. 2024 is coming very quickly. And I asked Mr. Zients the question, what is the President's plan to preserve Medicare? And really, a completely insufficient answer. That's because in this budget, there is no plan to preserve Medicare for my grandparents and for everyone who's relying on Medicare right now. When I reviewed the President's budget, what it reminded me of is a discussion I've had with my kids recently, because my kids in the last couple of weeks have been talking about Punxsutawney Phil, the groundhog who comes out to see and look at his shadow to see whether we're going to have more winter, right? Well, Punxsutawney Phil has already come out of his hole, but in Washington it's Groundhog Day all over again when it comes to the President's budget, because every year that this president has been in office, his proposed budgets have left us with trillion-dollar deficits, increased gross debt as a percentage of the share of our economy, continued massive spending, racking up enormous debt to where we will reach $26 trillion in 10 years, no plan to reform Social Security and Medicare to preserve these programs, and they are the mandatory spending, as Senator Thune mentioned, the largest driver of our debt, and massive tax increases. It's staggering when you think about a budget that offers close to the largest, if not the largest, tax increase in the history of our country, yet still runs a $1.3 trillion deficit this year and at least a $900 billion deficit in 2013. So it's the worst of all worlds. We're going to increase taxes on small businesses in this country that we're asking to generate revenue and create jobs, and yet we're still going to run trillion-dollar deficits. This is a very irresponsible budget, and we cannot afford a campaign document. We need a budget for this country, because when I think about where we are, when I think about what is happening in other countries around the world, in Europe, and the future of our country, and not only all of us here today, but what we will be passing on to my children and your children, because they can't repay $26 trillion in debt. How that's going to happen, and how fair is that? They didn't incur this debt. We did. We have a responsibility to address this now, and I've been deeply disappointed by this president and his failure of leadership on this issue. Think about it. My colleague, Senator Gregg, served on the President's Fiscal Commission. The President convenes a fiscal commission and ignores his own fiscal commission. In fact, since that time, we've incurred $1.5 trillion of debt since the fiscal commission issued a report. Last year, the President's budget came up for a vote in this body. It was so fiscally irresponsible that not one member of this chamber from either party or the independent voted for the budget. And that really says it all. And yet again, we have a similar budget being proposed by this president. That's why I say, unfortunately, it's Groundhog Day in Washington all over again. And it's unfortunate because the American people have seen this over and over again, and they're very, very tired because they understand at home they have to balance their budgets. They understand that at home they're making the difficult calls that need to be made to prioritize, and yet here in Washington, with this president's budget and the trajectory that our country is on because of the failure of leadership, we are in a position where we're hurting our country, where I'm very, very concerned about what we are passing on to the next generation. And I hope that my colleagues on the Senate Budget Committee will actually do the work that needs to be done and put together a responsible budget for this country, because it's been over 1,000 days since the Democrat-controlled Senate Budget Committee has actually done the work that needs to be done for this country. Because if the president's not going to do it, then I hope that in this body, in the United States Senate, that we will put together a responsible budget that gets our fiscal house in order for the future of our country. And I hope that this acting budget director, Mr. Zines, the next time he comes before the Senate Budget Committee, will just answer the questions that he's asked. I mean, this is simple math. When Senator Sessions asks him whether we're spending more money or not, you would hope you'd get a straight answer. And that's the least that the American people deserve. And I'm hoping that's what they will receive going forward. I would like to ask my colleague, Senator Sessions, the ranking member of the Budget Committee, what his impression of the President's budget is in terms of where it leads our country going forward and what he hopes that the Senate Budget Committee will do to address this fiscal crisis?
I thank my colleague, and I know that Senator Ayotte wanted to be on the Budget Committee, and we had a host of fabulous new senators that wanted to be on it. We got 4, but many more wanted to be on. Senator Portman, Senator Toomey, Senator Johnson, Senator Ayotte were selected. I would just say I know how disappointing it was because we've talked that we didn't even mark up a budget last year. Didn't even have, so the people who wanted to be on there to participate in the great issue of our time, the debt this nation is facing, got no ability and had no option, no opportunity to participate in the debate because the majority party in the Senate decided that was not what they wanted to do. And the majority leader said it would be foolish to have a budget. Now, I think it's very, very sad. So the President's budget represents an opportunity and a responsibility to guide this nation for the future. The President has no higher duty, no higher responsibility than to help the nation avoid an obvious crisis. Mr. Bowles and Senator Simpson, who chaired President Obama's Debt Commission, looked us in the eye and issued a joint statement at the Budget Committee last year about this time that it said the nation has never faced a more predictable economic crisis. And what they were saying was, if you don't change what you're doing, we are headed to a crisis. And Mr. Bowles, President Clinton's chief of staff, said to us that this crisis could happen within 2 years. I saw yesterday on the television, Morning Joe, Mr. Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations talk about Greece. He's internationally recognized, and he said the United States could be having this next year. But I would say what's stunning to me is that when you look at this budget, it does not change the debt trajectory, and we've looked at those numbers. We've looked at those numbers, and it does not change the debt trajectory. It increases spending and increases taxes, and at the end of the day, based on the current law that we achieved last year, minimum steps, but was achieved, the Budget Control Act numbers, that would allow the debt to increase $11.5 trillion next year. Under the President's budget that he asserts reduces the deficit by $4 trillion, the deficit would increase by $11.2 trillion. Almost no change at all. And we needed big change. And he took away some of the spending reductions and replaced it with more tax increases, the reductions we just painfully agreed to last August. So I am disappointed in the President's leadership on that. And Senator Thune, you've been here and dealt with these issues. Maybe you have comments about it. I would yield to you.
Well, I would say that Senator from Alabama that, that was interesting to me because at the White House Fiscal Responsibility Summit in February of 2009, and this is when in the context of discussing our unsustainable budget deficits, President Obama said the following, and I quote, "Contrary to the prevailing wisdom in Washington these past few years, we cannot simply spend as we please and defer the consequences to the next budget, the next administration, or the next generation," end quote. Well, that's exactly what he's been doing now for 4 years. Literally, every budget, every year, we think, okay, maybe this year the President is going to get serious because we've got a serious problem in this country. These are serious times in which we are living, and we've got to get the situation turned around or we are headed for certain disaster. And yet last year, as was noted, the President's budget, when it was put on the floor of the United States Senate, did not garner a single vote here. Not a single vote. It was 97-0. It was unanimously rejected by the United States Senate, members on both sides voting against it. Well, this year, you would think, okay, the situation is that much worse. Our fiscal situation has deteriorated even more. The amount of debt that we've racked up is continuing to accumulate. And we thought perhaps this year we would see a budget that actually did address these problems. And, of course, no. We got another budget that is filled with more spending, more debt, and higher taxes at a time, literally, when we need to be tackling spending. We need to be taking on saving Social Security and Medicaid or Medicare for the next generation and doing something to create economic growth in this country and get jobs created for American workers in this country. And what's really disappointing about it is not just the fact that the spending and debt situation is out of control, but also the impact that has on the economy. The senator from Alabama knows full well, because we've both have studied this subject. And if you look at the research that's been done with regard to the impact of spending and debt on economic growth and job creation, there is a clear correlation there. When you achieve a certain level or arrive at a certain level of debt as a percentage of your entire economy, 90% is the threshold, it costs you about a percentage point of economic growth every year, which means fewer jobs, in this case about 1 million fewer jobs in our economy. So the high sustained levels, chronic high levels of debt and spending are directly impacting our economy's ability to get out of this cycle that we're in and to start growing and expanding again and creating jobs for the American people.
You say it's directly impacting. The way I read the Rogoff-Reinhardt study, and I think of what I hear you saying is that this isn't just that a debt crisis might happen, and those can happen quickly, as they warn in their book, that a crisis can happen when you're at this debt level out of the blue for things you never expected, and you're in serious financial trouble, like our 2006-2007 financial crisis that nobody predicted. But I guess what I'm saying to you, they also indicate that huge debt can impact economic growth today. And they say when your debt reaches 90% of GDP, your debt is that much that it can slow growth by 1 to 2%. We're already at 100% of GDP. Do you think it's possible that their study, based on empirical data, might be telling us that the debt right now, because it weakens confidence and drains investment capital, that our debt now could be slowing our economy?
I think it's very clear, and I think if you look at the, as you said, debt as a percentage of GDP, now over 100%. I mean, think about that. This is the highest level of debt, highest level of spending as a percentage of our GDP that we've seen literally since the end of World War II. We have not seen anything that rivals it. We've seen now 4 years in a row where we've run trillion-dollar-plus deficits, and we've added, as was said earlier, nearly $5 trillion to the debt since this president took office. But when you get that kind of debt level sustained over time, it does have a direct impact on jobs in the economy, and I believe that we're paying a price for that right now. And you can look at what's happening, obviously, with the high levels of debt and the impact that it's having on countries in Europe. And so, you know, this whole idea with the president reducing his budget, not taking that issue on, not doing anything substantial or meaningful with regard to spending or debt, and then adding to it, making matters even worse, raising taxes by almost $2 trillion. You know, it seems like the most natural instinct, it's just in their DNA, everything has to be about raising taxes. And clearly that's not the solution. We all know that. In fact, we need to create policies that will be conducive to economic growth and job creation in this country. And raising taxes on investment, which is what the budget does. And by the way, it would raise capital gains tax rates from 15% to 20% right away. And then if you're hit by the Buffett rule, it would go up to 30%. It would raise the dividend tax rates from 15% up to over 39%, almost triple the tax on dividends in this country, which incidentally have already been taxed at the corporate, at the business level. And so you're talking about almost tripling the tax rate that we're going to pay, the Americans are going to have to pay on investment income in this country. And then you look at the Obamacare taxes that would kick in, the 3.8% on investment income. You add that and you start getting to a marginal income tax rate in this country that's up in the 43, 44% range. It is very hard to argue that can be anything but awful when it comes to jobs in this country. And so the entire budget, from the failure to address spending and debt, the failure to take on saving Social Security and Medicare by reforming our entitlement programs, and seems like constant reliance upon taxes as their answer to everything, this could not be a worse budget for the American people. It couldn't be a worse budget for the economy. It couldn't be a worse budget for jobs. And it certainly couldn't be a worse budget for seniors in this country as we continue to watch Medicare and Social Security, cascade further and further toward bankruptcy. So it's a bust as far as I'm concerned. I think that's why people on both sides and people in the media and the American people get it. It's time for this administration to get serious because these are serious times. And when you're going to do big things, you need presidential leadership. There are 100 senators, 435 members of Congress, 535 of us in all. There's only one president, one person who can sign a bill into law, one person who can engage the American public and the Congress in a way that will help us solve these big problems and tackle the challenges that we face as a nation right now. This budget does none of that.
Well, I thank Senator Thune for your comments and your leadership on all these matters that relate fundamentally to job creation and economic growth. Tax increases do not facilitate economic growth. And when you surge debt, it increases more and more pressure to raise taxes. A lot of people in my state say, Jeff, I tell you, just running up this debt so you'll have to raise taxes. That's what they plan all along. Whether it is or not, we're finding that. So we need to take steps today to put this country on a sound financial course. Just to demonstrate how impactful the debt is, this year, the interest on the debt that we will pay in the entire $3,700 billion that we spend, $225 billion will be spent on paying the interest on the money we borrow. A lot of people don't understand when we borrow money, we pay interest on it. And the interest rates at this point in history are some of the lowest in history for a developed economy. But the President's own budget, the tables he has in his own budget, the assumptions that he has about the expenses we'll have to pay, assumes that 10 years from today, we won't be paying $230 billion, but $850 billion. $850 billion. That's more than Social Security. That's more than Medicare. That's more than the Defense Department. That's 10 times what we spend on food stamps. It's multiple times what we spend on education and highways, maybe 20 times what we spend on highways. And we're talking about a highway bill today and trying to find the money to keep it on a basic level funding to find the money for that. And this interest is going to be hammering us every year because we're running extraordinary deficits every year. And the American people are not happy with us because they know there can be no excuse for spending $3,700 billion and taking in only $2,200 billion and borrowing 40 cents of every dollar, having to have interest be the fastest growing item in the entire budget of America, and soon to dwarf the Defense Department, even Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. I mean, this is not right. This is bad policy. There can be no excuses. And the President, the man who's captain of the ship, is having lunch somewhere while the ship is heading to the shoals and not providing any leadership to get us off this path. In fact, worse, I would say, the President attacks people who propose serious solutions. Paul Ryan in the House, they worked hard on a budget. They laid out some good proposals that would have changed the debt course of America. It was a historic budget. Don't you think, Senator Thune? We could disagree about parts of it, but and he was attacked by the President, who himself proposes nothing. And the leadership in this body won't even bring up a budget. He said it was foolish. Why is it foolish? Because if we have a budget debate on the floor of the Senate, people get to offer amendments and they get to debate the honest depth of danger this country faces. Honestly, openly, and you have to vote on it. And the majority leader doesn't want to have his members vote on it because he wants to avoid responsibility for facing the greatest crisis this nation is facing. Admiral Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, appointed by President Obama, said the greatest threat to our national security is the debt. That is true. It is out there. If we don't deal with it, we're going to have a crisis. So, I'm disappointed at this whole process. I was disappointed at the hearing today. I thought we got irresponsible answers. I think the budget is irresponsible and in no way deals with the main drivers, as you said, Senator Thune. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, food stamps, all entitlements. Those are not even touched in any serious way. They're increasing at 8%. The highest growth rate predicted by the President in their 10-year budget is 4%. So these programs are increasing twice the rate of GDP. That's unsustainable. It's unsustainable. And we need some leadership around here to confront it. And we don't need a president who attacks people who have the courage to actually lay out some plans to fix it.
If the Senator would just finally in closing on that, yield on that point, I do think that there will be a vote probably at some point. The House is going to pass a budget. We know that. I suspect what will happen is what happened last year. If the Senate fails to produce, the Democrat majority doesn't produce a budget here, we'll end up voting on the House budget, perhaps on the President's budget. But the regrettable thing about all that is that we are not doing our job as United States Senators. Over 1,000 days now, this will be the 4th year in a row in which this body has not adopted a budget. And what we've gotten from the President, of course, is not a serious one. And all they want to do is get out and demagogue and attack people who are serious about solving this problem. And last year, as was the case with the House-passed budget, when it came over here, it was routinely attacked and demagogued, but nothing ever put forward that would represent an alternative because they don't want to deal with these issues, and it's unfortunate for the American people.
Senator's time has expired.
We yield our time.
Thanks, Chair.
Madam President.
The Senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, I wanted to talk about another subject, and that is the 5 of the executive branch nominations that are pending before the Senate today. Just to put this in context, every day when the Senate is in session, one of the documents that is put on every desk here in the Senate chamber is what's called the executive calendar. And the executive calendar is a listing of all of the nominations that have been reported by the various committees of the Senate for consideration by the full Senate. And these are, of course, nominations that the President has made and asked the Senate to agree with. So there is usually a list of these executive nominations. I've become particularly concerned in recent weeks that this list has grown and grown and grown. And in fact, there are now 79 appointments that the President has made, nominations that the President has made that have been approved by the various committees of the Senate but have not been brought up and voted on here in the Senate itself. And that, to me, is a unfortunate result and one that we need to concern ourselves with. I want to particularly talk about 5 of these nominations for important offices in the Department of Energy. We have Secretary of Energy Stephen Chu coming before the Energy Committee on Thursday to talk about the President's proposed budget as it affects the Department of Energy in the upcoming year. And these are nominations for management positions in his department, which he is very much in favor of us moving ahead with. Each of these offices, these 5 that I'm talking about here, has important responsibilities. Together, the 5 of them make up a large part of the management structure of the Department of Energy. A frequent observation that I hear on the Senate floor about energy policy in our country is that the United States needs to have a, quote, all-of-the-above approach to energy. I don't know how we can execute a, quote, all-of-the-above strategy for energy when we have vacancies in the key government offices that oversee fossil energy, nuclear energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency, small and minority business access to energy programs, and we have a vacancy in the legal counsel office for the Department of Energy as well. The President has nominated 5 outstanding individuals to fill all of the above energy posts, and our committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, held hearings on each of the nominees, has examined their qualifications, and I'm pleased to report that the committee reported all 5 of these nominees unanimously, recommending to the full Senate that we approve them. The most senior of the 5 positions is the office of Undersecretary of Energy. The Undersecretary's responsibilities include energy efficiency, renewable energy, fossil energy, nuclear energy, and electricity. This position has been vacant for nearly a year and a half. The President's nominated Dr. Arun Majumdar to this important post. Dr. Majumdar is currently the Director of ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency located at the Department of Energy. The Senate confirmed Dr. Majumdar to the position he now holds at ARPA-E as the Director of ARPA-E in October of 2009. He's currently serving as the Undersecretary on an acting basis and serving as Secretary Chu's senior advisor. Dr. Majumdar is a highly distinguished scientist and engineer. Before he came to Washington, he was the Associate Laboratory Director for Energy and Environment at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He was a professor of mechanical engineering and material sciences and engineering at the University of California at Berkeley. He holds a dozen patents. He's authored close to 200 scientific papers. He served as an advisor to both the National Science Foundation and the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, as well as startup companies and venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. He holds a doctorate from UC Berkeley, and he is a member of the National Academy of Engineering. So it's clear to anyone who looks at his qualifications that he is an eminently qualified scientist, and frankly, we're very fortunate to have someone of his caliber willing to serve as the Undersecretary of Energy. The second nomination I want to talk about is for the General Counsel's position at the Department. This is, of course, the Department's top legal officer. This position has been vacant since last March, nearly a year. The President has nominated Gregory Woods to be the General Counsel. Mr. Woods is currently the Deputy General Counsel in the Department of Transportation. He was previously a partner in a New York law firm. He was a trial lawyer in the Department of Justice before that. The third office that I want to speak about is the Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy. This important office is responsible for research and development programs that cover coal, oil, and natural gas, and it's a position that has been vacant for over a year. The President has nominated Charles McConnell to be the next Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy. Mr. McConnell is currently the Chief Operating Officer of the Office of Fossil Energy. Before coming to the Department of Energy, he spent 2 years as a Vice President at Battelle Energy Technology and 31 years before that at Praxair, Inc., a Fortune 300 company that produces industrial gases. The fourth vacant office I want to speak briefly about is that of the Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. This office is responsible for programs designed to increase the production and use of solar and wind and geothermal and biomass and hydrogen and ethanol fuels, and for improving energy efficiency in the transportation and building and industrial and utility sectors, and for administering programs that provide financial assistance to state energy programs and weatherization for low-income housing. For this position, the President's nominated Dr. David Danielson. Dr. Danielson is currently a program director at ARPA-E. Before that, he was a clean energy venture capitalist specializing in financing of solar and wind and biofuels and carbon capture and storage and advanced lighting projects. He holds a doctorate in material science and engineering from MIT. The fifth and final office I want to mention is that of the Director of Minority Economic Impact, which is responsible for advising the Secretary on the effects of energy policies on minority business enterprises and educational institutions and communities, and on ways to ensure that minorities are afforded an opportunity to participate fully in the Department's programs. This position has been vacant for nearly 2 years. The President's nominated Ladoris Harris to head the office. Ms. Harris is currently the President and Chief Executive Officer of Jabo Industries, a minority woman-owned management consulting firm that specializes in energy and information technology and the healthcare industry. She's previously been an executive with the General Electric Company and has held executive and management positions at ABB and at Westinghouse before that. Madam President, all 5 of these nominees are outstanding individuals who are especially well qualified for the positions for which they have been nominated. These are important positions. They need to be filled. All 5 nominations were unanimously reported, as I indicated before, by our Energy and Natural Resources Committee this last fall. 4 of them have been on the calendar, the Senate's calendar here, since November 10. The 5th was added on the 15th of December. I'm not aware of a single objection that has been raised, any objection on any substantive basis for any one of these. And in my view, they all deserve to be confirmed, and Secretary Chu deserves to have them confirmed so that he can implement the policies and the laws that we are enacting in a responsible way. Madam President, I will ask now for consent to go ahead and approve these nominees and see if we can get at least this 5 out of the 79 that are on the executive calendar approved, and hopefully that will allow senators to see that there is a way to get some of these other executive nominees approved as well. So I would ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations, calendar numbers 493, 494, 495, 496, and 527, that the nominations be confirmed in block, the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order to any of the nominations, that any related statements be printed in the record, and that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection to the request?
Madam President,
The Senator from Kentucky.
reserving the right to object, I would like to accommodate the President in these nominees. I think the Chairman and the distinguished Senator from New Mexico has made very good points about their qualifications. But I would be remiss if I did not rise in support of 1,200 jobs in Paducah, Kentucky, who are threatened to be lost because the Department of Energy is refusing to address the situation. We have a company that has 1,200 jobs in Paducah, Kentucky, that enriches uranium. For 50 years, uranium has been accumulating, and it sits on the ground as a waste product. We could recycle this. It's a green project. It costs no taxes. In fact, it will actually bring back money to the Treasury. And what I would like is help from the Chairman, as well as the President, as well as Secretary Chu on this issue. I've written to Secretary Chu, and we haven't heard back. This is very important to us. We are in the midst of a great recession, and 1,200 people are destined to lose their jobs. Once again, this doesn't cause any spending, doesn't cost any taxes,
And actually, if you would allow us to re-enrich this uranium, it would bring money back to the Treasury. That is my reason for holding this, and I would hope that we could find some reason and means to accommodate each other. Until that time, I would continue to object to these nominations.
Madam
Objection
President,
is heard. The senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, maybe if I could just be clear as to exactly what action the senator from Kentucky is requesting of the Secretary. And I know that he indicated that the Secretary, he had contacted the Secretary or written to the Secretary and had not heard back. But is there some specific action that the Secretary is being asked to take that we could clarify so that we would know whether this is a request that could be accommodated?
Madam President,
Senator from Kentucky.
in response to that question, yes, the government owns the uranium. It's been sitting there for 50 years. It's my understanding that the Department of Energy or the President could at any time sign a statement saying that that uranium can be enriched. It is really completely under the prerogative. 1,200 jobs could be saved. These are good-paying jobs. Many of these are union jobs. These are people who I would like to help in my state, and it doesn't cost the government anything. It doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. In fact, it uses a waste product that's sitting on the ground. And we've had an agreement. We have worked with the United Uranium Mine Workers. We have worked with senators and congressmen from different states to try to get this figured out. But all it takes is a signature from the Department of Energy to allow them to enrich this uranium. The Defense Department has written statements saying that they could use this uranium. The GAO has said that this would bring back, and this is the best use of this waste product. But I believe that the Secretary of Energy, through a stroke of the pen, could save these 1,200 jobs, and that's